Something is happening right now that deserves your full, undivided attention, and it is not something the mainstream news cycle will walk you through slowly or honestly. What you are watching unfold across the Middle East today is not simply a military conflict between the United States and Iran. What you are watching is a collision between two entirely different visions of how the world is supposed to work, and the outcome of that collision will shape everything from the price of gas you pump into your car tomorrow morning to the political future of the most powerful office on earth. Iran has declared its army is still in a full war situation. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, remains closed and contested. Iran's deputy head of the National Security Committee has stated publicly that Iran will never relinquish control over the Strait of Hormuz and that Iran still holds sufficient missile stockpiles to sustain several years of war. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is posting images of himself holding a rifle on Truth Social, warning Iran to get smart soon, while simultaneously facing a constitutional confrontation with his own Congress that could technically end his ability to wage this war altogether. And through it all, peace talks are stalling, a ceasefire is fraying, and the global economy is bleeding quietly in the background. This is the story, the real one. Now let's slow down and actually think through what is happening here, because if you are only catching headlines, you are missing the architecture of this crisis entirely. The 2026 Iran war began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran under what the Pentagon named Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership. The opening salvo killed Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Iran responded with a torrent of hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones across the region. That is the moment this all began. And from that moment forward, nothing has gone according to plan, and not for Washington, not for Tehran, and certainly not for the global order that everyone assumed would somehow hold steady while two of the world's most consequential powers went to war. Let's start with Iran, because the most important thing you need to understand right now is that Iran has not collapsed. That's the piece the narrative you're being sold keeps trying to avoid. Iran's war strategy was always designed to widen the arena of conflict, to move beyond pure military confrontation and into the political and economic realms, with the aim of withstanding bombardment until the conflict became too costly for the United States and Israel to sustain. And if you look at what has actually happened over the past 60 days, you have to admit, at least privately, that this strategy has not failed. Iran struck American embassies and military installations across the Gulf. It triggered economic disruptions that sent oil prices surging from roughly $70 a barrel to well over $100. Iran saw an average boost in oil revenue of nearly $25 million per day in March, even while being bombed, while Russia saw an average increase of about $150 million per day in the same period. These are not the numbers of a country that is losing in any straightforward sense. These are the numbers of a country that understood the economic geometry of this conflict better than its adversaries did. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz itself. Think carefully about what this waterway represents. Until the war erupted, the Strait of Hormuz carried roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. Iran has used attacks from boats, missiles and drones, sea mines, and satellite spoofing to close it, methods that are easy to use and difficult to oppose, and which have drastically increased insurance costs, preventing most ship owners from taking the risk of sailing through. That is leverage in its purest and most devastating form. Iran didn't need to defeat the United States militarily. It needed to make the cost of this war feel real to ordinary people everywhere. And closing the Strait of Hormuz did exactly that. Now let's look at what the United States has been doing in response. On April 13th, the US launched a counter-blockade of the strait, targeting all ships seeking to reach Iranian ports. A dual blockade emerged, Iran blocking outbound oil from the Gulf, the United States blocking inbound commerce to Iranian ports. Operation Epic Fury has cost the Pentagon about $25 billion so far, with most of that spending tied to munitions. $25 billion in roughly 60 days, and there is still no deal, no clear exit, no defined victory. The Pentagon has been asked repeatedly by Congress to explain what winning looks like, and the answers have been, at best, inconsistent. Here is where things get genuinely interesting from a political standpoint, because this is where the pressure inside the American system starts to become visible. A post-Vietnam law called the War Powers Resolution puts a 60-day clock on the use of military force without congressional authorization. The war in Iran, for which the Trump administration sought no approval, hit that 60-day mark on May 1st, and the response from within Washington's own walls has been remarkable if you know how to read it. The Senate has voted 4 times this year to block resolutions invoking the War Powers Act, with Republicans largely arguing that cutting off military operations abruptly could endanger U.S. forces and embolden Iran. But those votes keep happening. Democrats keep forcing them. And every single time, the margins reveal a political coalition that is under real strain. Republican Senator John Curtis wrote publicly that he would not support ongoing military action beyond a 60-day window without congressional approval, citing both historical and constitutional reasons. Republican Congressman Don Bacon stated plainly that by law, Congress must either approve continued operations or force them to stop, and that if approval is not granted, military operations are legally required to cease. These are not Democrats speaking. These are members of Trump's own party, and they are starting to say things out loud that were previously only whispered in private. Senator Susan Collins, facing a tough re-election fight, slammed Trump's remarks as incendiary and called for a swift end to the conflict, saying she would not vote for ground troops or to extend the conflict past 60 days unless there is a dramatic change. Now, why does this matter so much? It matters because it reveals that the political consensus holding this war together is not nearly as solid as it appears from the surface. Trump launched this war on the strength of executive authority alone, with no vote, no formal declaration, no authorization from the legislature. And while Congress has so far declined to stop him, the architecture of that refusal is fragile. Constitutional experts argue that after May 1st, the war will enter a blatantly illegal phase under the War Powers Act. The courts, historically, have avoided inserting themselves into these questions, which means the entire thing depends on political will. And political will shifts when wars drag on, cost money, and fail to produce clean victories. And this one is not producing clean victories, let's be honest about that. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth told lawmakers that Iran's one-way attack drones were down 95% and described it as sheer desperation in the Straits of Hormuz. But in the very same breath, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Kane acknowledged that Iran retains the capability to harm friendly forces and commercial shipping, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, and that targeting Iran's mine-laying capabilities remains an ongoing priority for CENTCOM. You can't have it both ways. You can't tell the American public that Iran has been decimated and simultaneously tell military commanders that Iran still represents a serious threat to shipping and to American forces. Those two statements cannot coexist honestly. And then there is the question of the peace talks themselves, because for several weeks there has been a ceasefire nominally in effect and negotiations have been grinding along through Pakistan as a mediator. Mediators in Pakistan were expecting to receive a revised proposal from Iran, after Trump indicated he would not accept an earlier version that called for ending the war first and settling the thornier issues related to Iran's nuclear program at a later stage. The core of the disagreement is fundamental. Iran wants to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, end the war, and deal with the nuclear question separately. Trump's position is that there can be no deal unless Iran agrees up front that it will never have nuclear weapons. Trump told reporters directly from the Oval Office that he would never accept a deal unless Iran agreed there would be no nuclear weapons, insisting this was the non-negotiable red line. On the surface, this looks like a simple standoff between two stubborn parties. But dig a little deeper and you start to see something more troubling. The longer this drags on without resolution, the more it benefits specific actors and harms others. The global energy disruption is creating enormous windfalls for Russia, for Gulf states that can sell oil at elevated prices, and ironically for Iran itself through the inflation of whatever oil does make it to market. The people being hurt most directly are ordinary working Americans, the ones paying more at the pump, the ones whose household budgets are being squeezed by the economic ripple effects of a war they didn't vote for and may not fully understand. The Iranian oil minister responded to the US naval blockade by urging the public to cut consumption and calling conservation a religious duty, dismissing the impact of the blockade entirely, saying the enemy would achieve nothing through a naval blockade and that there was no worry about fuel supply. Now you can read that as propaganda, as the words of a government trying to project calm, and perhaps it partly is, but you can also read it as something else, as a government that has made its calculations and decided that time is on its side, that the longer this goes, the more the internal political pressure on Washington builds, and the more the rest of the world loses patience with what looks, from the outside, like a war of choice that is disrupting global commerce and pushing humanity toward a reckoning no one planned for. Iran has executed at least 21 people and arrested more than 4,000 since the beginning of the war, according to the United Nations, which criticized the Islamic Republic's harsh and brutal treatment of its people. That is the internal cost of a government at war: crackdowns, silence, the suppression of dissent at the moment when dissent is most dangerous. And yet the regime is holding. The supreme leader's location is reportedly being kept secret because the threat is real, but the decision-making structure of the Iranian state is continuing to function, continuing to negotiate, continuing to play a long game that neither Washington nor Tel Aviv seems to have fully prepared for. The ceasefire talks have been complicated by the difficulty of communicating with Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, whose location is being kept secret, slowing down the process considerably. Meanwhile, Trump cancelled plans for face-to-face negotiations in Pakistan, posting on Truth Social that there was too much time wasted on traveling. Trump told reporters that negotiations are now happening telephonically, saying he makes a call or has his people make a call and gets an answer in 15 minutes, while acknowledging he prefers face-to-face engagement. Conducting the diplomacy of one of the most complex and dangerous military conflicts in decades over the phone, in between Truth Social posts of yourself holding a rifle. That is the reality of where we are, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The UAE announced it will withdraw from OPEC this week as the Iran war continues to roil global energy markets. The country's energy minister told CNN that the UAE took this decision now because the closure of the Strait of Hormuz limits the immediate impact on the oil market. That is a seismic development in its own right. The UAE leaving OPEC is not a footnote. It is a signal that the old architecture of Middle Eastern energy politics, the architecture that has governed global oil prices and power dynamics for decades, is fracturing under the weight of this conflict. When one of the major Gulf states decides it needs to operate outside the cartel because the cartel's operating environment has been fundamentally altered by war, that tells you something profound about the long-term structural damage this conflict is causing. More than 1.2 million people in Lebanon are expected to face acute food insecurity at crisis levels between April and August 2026, according to a UN-backed report, marking a significant deterioration from the period before the war erupted. Lebanon is being pulled back into a catastrophe it barely survived before. Israel continues to strike targets in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah continues to fire rockets into Israel. And the human cost of all of this, the displaced families, the hunger, the shattered infrastructure, is accumulating quietly in the background of a news cycle that prefers to focus on the drama between Trump and Tehran. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at a genuinely historic inflection point. Trump told reporters that the wars in Iran and Ukraine could end on a similar timetable, following a conversation with Vladimir Putin, in which Putin reportedly offered to help with Iran's uranium stockpiles. Russia is now positioning itself as a potential mediator in the Iran situation, which tells you something important about whose interests are actually being served by the prolonged uncertainty. The longer the strait stays closed, the more European and Asian economies suffer, the more American political capital gets consumed, and the more leverage Moscow and Beijing accumulate simply by staying out of the direct fight. Alaaddin Borusherdi, Iran's deputy head of the National Security Committee, dismissed Trump's threats as endless and empty, saying they would only result in further damage to America's reputation and a demonstration of Iran's strength, and declaring that Iran still holds the upper hand. Whether or not you believe that claim, the fact that it is being made confidently, publicly, by senior Iranian officials, tells you that Tehran does not view itself as being in a position of desperate weakness. It views itself as a party with leverage, with time, and with a strategy that is working at least well enough to keep the conflict unresolved on terms that are not entirely unfavorable to Iran. The May 1st deadline under the War Powers Act has now arrived. Congress has not authorized this war. The administration has not formally requested that it do so. Republicans have shown general unity in not publicly opposing the war with Iran, despite a handful of defectors, while Senate Majority Leader John Thune and the chairman of the Armed Services Committee have so far not indicated any plans to bring forward legislation to authorize the war. What this means, in practical terms, is that the United States is now waging a war that costs tens of billions of dollars, has killed American service members, has disrupted the global economy, and is being conducted without the explicit constitutional authority that the law requires. That is not a partisan talking point. That is simply where the facts lead when you follow them carefully and honestly. The question that matters now is not whether Trump will back down. Historically, presidents in this position don't back down. They find creative legal interpretations, they extend deadlines, they redefine the nature of the hostilities so as not to trigger the statutory clock. Previous presidents have found ways to continue military adventures beyond 60 days, despite the law's clear wording, but none of those were of the scope and scale of the US and Israel's war on Iran. This is genuinely unprecedented territory, and the combination of an unresolved military conflict, a blocked global waterway, a fracturing political coalition in Congress, an Iranian regime that is battered but still functional, and a diplomatic process that is moving at glacial speed through Pakistani intermediaries. That combination is not a situation that resolves itself quickly or cleanly. What you are watching is a world in the process of reorganizing itself. The old certainties about American military dominance, about the stability of Middle Eastern energy markets, about the permanence of the post-war international order, are all under simultaneous pressure right now. And the honest thing to say, the thing that serious analysis demands, is that nobody on any side of this conflict can tell you with confidence how it ends.